I am so excited to have Rachel Valentina Gonzalez here with me today for, well, a podcast for Latinx Pop Lab. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here too.
I want to hear all about everything that you do, because you're like amazing, and you're carving all these new paths for us to really understand and enrich our understanding of Latinx pop culture. But let's hear your origin story. What's your your why?
My why. That's a really good question, and it's it's not as exciting as you might think as origin stories go. But first, I have to say I love this idea of the lived Latinx pop culture. Like, I'm gonna steal that. I'm gonna use that. I'm gonna define that in my next article. It's there. Credit with credit. So I started working on Quinceañeras. That's my area. So I'm a folklorist. So I'm a folklorist who's kind of on the edge of my quote unquote discipline, because I'm not really interested in the traditional boundaries of what people consider folklore. I'm absolutely interested in sort of the way that the tentacles of folklore and popular culture, commercial culture, mass culture, and the politics of race in those contexts comes together. So although I think about the traditional, I'm actually really not interested. I was never really interested in sort of the fetishizing of particular objects or objects of study. Instead, I'm super interested in these contexts, right? And so for me, pop culture is one of these complicated social contexts where things like tradition, practices, terms, right, appear and are used and changed and then circulated. So when I first was in graduate school, sort of mid-level graduate school, I had a professor ask me to give a talk to her American folklore class. And I was a TA for that class. So this is one of those moments of like, yes, professor, I'll do whatever you want me to do. And she wanted a talk on quinceañera dresses. And in all honesty, she made a huge assumption that as a Latina, I knew exactly everything about quinceañera dresses. And so I was likely going to come and bring my own pictures or my own experiences. And I was really at sort of empty with that. I did not grow up going to quinceañeras. Quinceañeras were, these coming of age celebrations for very girly Latinas. I've always been on the sort of queer spectrum, but also I was raised by Chicanos. Both of my parents we were in the Bay Area during the Chicano movement, and so very politically oriented, and I grew up working class. So the idea that those intersection of money and sort of a cultural perspective, time, right, sort of gender identity, none of that fit. So I was really starting from scratch. But I was like, I can do it, I will do it. And so what I found was that it was hard to find things. I mean, like so many of us, right, the origin story is there's an opening, or really there's a gap. Right? There's kind of a hole. And because I was consistently sort of the only Latina or Latino in much of my classes, in my graduate program, right? From, every other year or so, there's one of us, and we cling to each other when we meet. But the idea that there wasn't like a lot of talk around Latinx cultural practices at all. So I really was kind of just going to the library when we could still go to the library, and really just trying to fill in these different gaps of, okay, what am I looking for? Who am I thinking of? And of course, I kind of found my way into Chicana feminist narratives, Norma Cantu, and these other stories that were really, 20 years old already, right? And then nothing else. And so as I started to investigate, it was really like, well, there's not much here that feels relevant, right? Talking to a classroom, even in the early 2000s to, a bunch of 18 and 19-year-olds about, Chicago in the early 90s or the late 80s wasn't going to appeal, right? So what I found was that I started doing this presentation, and now if I look back, I would be so embarrassed to think about some of the things that I may have said. I was still very much on the, this sort of track of more of a traditional narrative of what was going on and what's happening. Because in many ways, I myself was raised with a lot of stereotypes. And so really by the end of maybe my second year in graduate school, maybe my third year, I realized I had something that was digging at me, right? There's something that's so big, that was so popular, or at least well-known sort of in a wider community, right? I had seen dress shops, I understood planners being around. But the idea that there was such a discrepancy between sort of what was in print, sort of what was this academic narrative, and the fact that as, you know, a fairly young Latinx person, that I couldn't really put two and two together about the tradition that people assumed I knew, that I knew I had to keep digging. And so from that, it just sort of spread. And I decided to figure out, well, what is it about this tradition that makes it specifically difficult for generations of Latinx scholars to talk about? Why was there a gap, right? We have so many studies on things like La Llorona, you know, thinking about labor histories. There's all sorts of tough conversations that scholars in Latinx studies have, but the quinceañera almost seemed like it wasn't worth people's time. And so again, thinking about gender studies, thinking about equity, I was like, well, then I'm gonna figure out what's going on. And so it really started from there. But my initial training, in anthropology was really linguistically oriented. So I had spent a lot of time thinking about masculinity and insults. And so when I switched to quinceañeras, it was sort of a similar place in my mind where I was thinking it was kind of pejorative to be thinking about young women as sort of these vacuous teenagers, right? Thinking about the way in which quinceañera had kind of a dirty word scenario to it within sort of this more intellectual Latinx community. And so I felt like, well, I love some good marginal raunch, and however that looks. So I thought, well, let's dig in. And so really a focus on quinceañeras that really wanted to say, like, what are we selling and how much are we selling it for, and what's at stake was really an exciting premise for me.
Yeah, and the kind of deep dive and digging in to enrich our understanding of quinces then kind of spreads out across, you know, other aspects of our pop cultural sort of space, right?
Absolutely. And actually, I was going to say that's exactly what it does. And that's really where I realized I had to make decisions about disciplinary boundaries. As in, maybe I don't need disciplinary boundaries. I had to understand that writing this piece and saying there's a huge conversation to be had that has nothing to do with quote unquote folklore. That's definitely cultural studies, anthropological, but absolutely rooted in the popular, where it's pop culture, this idea of audiences and production, that to me resonated so much more with actual lived experience than trying to narrate sort of the archive of how one accomplishes a quinceañera in material form.
And look, it's this beautiful book now, Style and Social Belonging in Latinx Consumer Identities. Can you tell us about that?
Absolutely. At least I think I can. I feel like, so this book took a little time in a way that I laugh at myself in the game, like, when did it change between, you know, the last version to when I said I'm done with it? And there was really a good 10 months when I probably could have submitted my book and I didn't. And so this, you know, as a first generation, you know, Latina graduate student to being a first generation faculty, the book is absolutely a labor of love, but also a lot of deeper, complex relationships with academia, right? And trying to write something that both has social value within the academy, but also still speaks from the premise that this is also mine and it also belongs to these women, young women, and sort of this body, a generation of Latinx youth, men and women, differentially identified, right? So this book is really about social positioning. This is a book about thinking about the ways in which Latinx youth, particularly feminine youth, women in particular, because if we're thinking about the quinceañera in its most traditional sense, we're thinking about heteronormative sexuality. So part of this is thinking about how are we allowed to be public? And so part of that is really getting at sort of really old school traditional gender norms, where this idea that women are part of this traditional spiritual domestic sphere and men are the public facing entities in our communities. They're allowed to have jobs, they're allowed independence, they're allowed all sorts of things that women are not. Even this question of, you know, what is safe, what is not safe, what does it mean to have a voice, and what does it mean to be happily silent, right? And so thinking a little bit about that, the premise of Quinceañera Style is really thinking about a different kind of self-posturing. And that's actually something that came, I thought I knew what this book was about when I started writing it. I did not. the style angle, this angle very particularly about, it isn't really about tradition, it's about how our traditions are represented. And that's sort of this radiating circle from how I represent as a quinceañera a dress on my body, thinking about aesthetics and color and texture and attitude, right? To the way in which we find that the quinceañera becomes emblematic of our communities in film, in TV, in comic books, right? And realizing that there's a huge discourse of the way in which this material tradition is telling a story, or 1,000, a polyvocal story that's telling 100 stories at once, depending on who's reading it. That was just, to me, so fascinating. So a lot of people, when I talked about the book, they were like, oh, you must have been to hundreds of quinceañeras. I'm like, nah, that's kind of not where I'm going with this. Although that's very interesting. I absolutely appreciate people's practices, right? What they're specifically doing. But what was more interesting to me was saying, where are you getting the information that's influencing your choices? Where are you even getting the idea that you have a choice? Because generationally speaking, thinking about Chicanas, particularly writing in the 80s and the 90s, really picking up a Chicana feminist ethos, quinceañeras were not about choice. They were about being forced into a gender norm. And so one of the things that I really wanted to be able to bring out in this is that this is not necessarily a story of endemic heterosexuality, right? In fact, that's kind of the problem, or a problem, one of the problems that have impacted not just the lived experiences of Latinos, but sort of the PR representation for our traditions writ large. And so thinking about talking to queer folks, thinking about the arbitrariness of gender by thinking about the ways in which products are labeled, right? How a dress, and so the first chapter really thinks about the production of a public identity of quinceañeras, and it really starts with popular culture. I claim that this consumer turn in these traditions, right? We have this nostalgic sense of querido Mexico, like what are we remembering through this process? And I'm saying, I think what we're talking about is Thalia and her and the novela Quinceañera, right? We're thinking about this outward-facing, blurred mix of hemispheric knowledge circulation that said U.S. Latinx communities, grandmas were watching that in the 80s, and daughters and nieces, we were all exposed to a particular vision of something that we didn't know was part of our cultural heritage until novelas told us. And so thinking that's a whole other body of discourse, right? Of people thinking about, Mexican television or Latinx television coming from Mexico and other parts of sort of Spanish-speaking production more broadly. So thinking about this arbitrariness, right? Thinking about shelves, thinking about what does it mean to find one's identity on a shelf, rather than thinking about that these narratives of community and culture are coming from really these romantic stories of abuelas and tias that are pulling through. Some of them are, but realizing that most and almost all of the young women and the families that I talk to, I call them first gen quinceañeras, because, they're the product of usually really, really, muy fuerte, really like, heart-wrenching immigrant stories where they didn't leave wealth. They didn't leave a middle-class identity in Latin America, mostly Mexico, and have a quinceañera and then come to the U.S. and recreate it. They came to an environment that told them that quinceañeras were part of their cultural heritage. They were very much sort of an American construction. And so where's that coming from? We're thinking about the external, this external narrative, whether it's pop culture, whether it's, dress shops that now have dresses that are labeled quinceañera, right? And so to me, that was really important, right? To externalize and to say, this is a dialectic between Latinx consumers and this broader market space, right? And we know in the United States, thinking about the market and thinking about consumers and people that are marked as valid consumers, right, represent a different kind of social citizen, right? Those of us that they care where we spend our money. And so between thinking about the consumer drive and thinking about, okay, what are these other things, these experiential buy-ins, right? Makeup, hair, and sort of saying there's always probably been that deal or that cousin who's helping you choreograph a dance that no one said wasn't straight, but everyone kind of knew was different. And the idea, so the chapter thinking about salon professionals and stylists who are particularly gay men, right? And that they have an interesting personal investment, right, in what a quinceañera looks like, and that we're taking, and sometimes with very conservative Latinx families are taking their cue on what is beautiful, what is heteronormative from a cadre of gay men. And so I found that humorous, but I found that story became very important. And underneath that story is this idea of immigrant labor, right? People, that American dream on some level, coming to the US, establishing your business, and deciding that there's value to the experiences of being closer to sort of Mexicanness, closer to a foreign, quote unquote, identity, from people that are here saying, I need an authentic narrative on what my daughter is putting on her body. Even though I kind of laugh, it all comes from China. So that global scale kind of comes in as we think about makeup and hair and style. It seems very niche. It seems very racialized and personalized, and it is, but the same objects are being contextualized differently in different communities, right? And so this is one place to see sort of a condensed experience of how Latinx communities, right, are contextualizing some of these larger economic streams, right? There's this whole narrative. My favorite chapter is I believe chapter 5, but it's about trans performance. And so a very good friend of mine, Leah Garcia, who identifies as a mujer trans, is a performance artist in Mexico City, right? She identifies as an activist, as an artist, but she was really, I kind of laughed because, you know how research works, you kind of stumble onto people. And I found that a friend of a friend introduced us, and I went to Mexico, like, can I talk to you? Can I see you? And we had this beautiful kind of philosophical experience and relationship over multiple years, going to visit her and seeing what she was doing. But for her, the quinceañera wasn't popular culture. It had a very sacred sense to it. And so seeing this sort of arc from like the most outlandish sort of style changes, dress changes, thematic changes, to sort of the middle class teenager experience that Latinx youth were sort of producing in the US. And then to go to Mexico City and see this well-educated performance artist drawing in sort of middle-aged Mexican men to touch her, hold her hand, to dance with her on the street, because she was putting on an impromptu quinceañera performance, you know, in the metro in Mexico City, was sort of a full circle of sort of this sacred affective environment that is created when we have a quinceañera celebration, even though at times it's obscured by this consumerism, right? It is still very much this space of bringing people together, right? This idea, this notion that one of my first collaborators said to me, you know, that the event that she created for her daughter, people thought it was beautiful. And people came from all over the state and from other states to California to celebrate her daughter. And there was this emotion to what she was saying, because she's like, you know, I never went to college. I don't have a great job. But I can be creative. I can do this. And so this angle of, you know, making do with these different elements, even so far as to think about, you know, thinking about rascuachismo in, you know, Latinx communities and thinking about that art aesthetic, it was this idea of having an impact on others. And that's definitely where the discussion with Leah takes us, and really combining issues of not just the celebration itself, but particularly this narrative of deception, which in queer trans studies, thinking about the violence on trans bodies, brown trans bodies in particular, trans bodies across the hemisphere, right? Brazil's number 1, but Mexico's number 2 in terms of deaths of mujeres trans. And, you know, we sort of talked about the way in which this notion of deception is sort of doubled onto a quinceañera event. So the idea that part of Leah's artivism was this idea that she passes very well as a heterosexual woman, you know, especially if you're, you know, donning a gown, spinning to the right music. People recognize the event before they look to her body for cues. So she gathers a crowd, she holds hands, right? She embraces people, and then she speaks, and it's in her voice that she gives herself away, quote unquote. And she's like, that's the moment where things turn. That's the moment where things can get dangerous. In the same way when quinceañeras speak and say something that maybe their family doesn't want them to say, but she was really thinking about physical violence. And luckily, she has not encountered that in her performances. But part of that is thinking about how she touches people, even just in a few moments, right? This ability to create a blip, right? Where someone would say, I don't believe in trans people are real, or I don't believe, genders, or, that sort of the criticism towards non-binary identities is just sort of dissolved for a second. And part of what facilitates that dissolving is that she captivates people by something that's utterly familiar and beautiful and nostalgic and absolutely part of a cultural identity that her audience believes in. And then she twists it on you. And it's beautiful and it's fantastic. But what it also comes down to, right, there are people, she says, that begrudgingly sort of be like, oh, you're not necessarily what I thought, and they maybe walk away. But it's thinking with the quinceañera, one of the biggest pushbacks I got with discussing, even within Latino communities, was the idea of these flashy events. Can people really afford them? And, this was an interesting conversation because we're talking about financial autonomy. We're talking about sort of this racialized capitalism, like the idea that if you look at these celebrations and you use a very narrow lens that's based on a deficit thinking about Latino communities carte blanche, right? So the same way as, we're just passing through this 2020 election, and that notion of the complications around the quote unquote, Latinx voter base, who is the Latinx voter? Well, that is, 25 to 100 interpretations, right, depending on who you are. And so that same kind of way on the regular, the way that Latinos we're all sort of lumped into that same identity, really gives people sort of, this audacity to ask, well, do Latino people have the money that they're spending? And it's like, well, what does it matter to you, right? What does it mean that you expect people to live in a kind of noble poverty based on whatever your assumption is about what money they have or don't have? And so what it came to was this idea that people felt either Latinx communities who are a little more conservative, so people who say, you only should spend the money if you have it, you shouldn't ask for money, or people outside the community, racial others, usually white men, who would ask, well, isn't this, they would get upset as though the event was somehow deceptive. And they would say things like, well, I can't afford this for my children. It's like, you probably could. You're just making choices with your money that are different. But this idea that we have a choice, one with how to spend our money, but the idea that we would dare spend our money publicly, right? When, don't you know, the stereotype is you people work really hard, but you don't have very much. Or, you look ignorant, or you're poor and you don't know what to do with your money. I found that particularly grating. And it came from within the community as much as it came from without. But there's definitely this idea of the audacity to look like you might have a different class standing than I assume you should. And so Leah's performances, thinking about the trans body, thinking about, drawing someone in and then sort of changing the narrative on them. And that same kind of way that but that's based on kind of a misunderstanding, right? In the same way, the ignorance that people bring to the quinceañera as a celebration that needs to be both curtailed or edited by some kind of intelligentsia that can pat these immigrants on the head and tell them how to spend their money. It's like, that's no, like that's just not, and you're thinking about most of the folks that I talk to lived through much more rigorous life experiences than I have. They know how to spend $1 or $500, right? That is their choice. And so where that became really significant was just comments from mothers in particular. And there's one comment, or sort of two comments, that really lead for me through the whole book, and particularly into the conclusion, which is thinking about one, what kind of social citizens Latinos, particularly Latinas, are allowed to be, and how that's kind of a narrative of our social value in our homes, right? What our possibility is. This is really, to me, a book about what becomes possible. How do we narrate our community's possibilities, and how do we inadvertently squelch our community's possibilities in these ways that look so familiar and traditional? And so with that, I was thinking a little bit, kind of going back to sort of older narratives of the stereotypes or the assumptions of the Mexican, in particular the Mexican family. And that is the mother's role, this mujer abnegada, the abnegated woman who is just self-sacrificing and in turmoil, but always working for somebody else, never caring for herself. And, you know, thinking about every sort of old Mexican film, or even sort of the churro films from the 70s that were sort of, there's the good woman and the bad woman, but the good woman is always self-sacrificing, is always sweet and kind, is always cooking for you and caring for you and taking people's crap, and working with it, right? It's sort of our stereotype, and thinking about what we pass on to our daughters, right? What gets passed down in the same way we think about tradition. And so part of me, you know, I was split between this idea of understanding that the mothers, not really the girls, the mothers that I was speaking to, and the aunts and, you know, the folks that were raising children and planning events, they weren't concerned about adulthood. They weren't concerned about college or pregnancy or some of the like big button issues that become like why we need to control our daughters. Most of them assumed their children would go to college. None of them were sort of, you know, this wasn't the end of the line for them in any way, which is the way so many academic and popular narratives depict it, right? You're investing, and so you must think this is the biggest point in their life. And they're like, actually, we don't. We hope that this event gives them a jumping off point. This is about creating a body of positive memories, in most cases, that they themselves never had. So it becomes this narrative of saying, I want my daughter to be a child just a little bit longer, and I want her to be able to be, when she goes to college, to look back and say, my parents loved me, look at what they sacrificed, but also to not have the same burden. There's a kind of emotional burden that I think mothers are inadvertently trying to lift from their daughters, and that is that you're allowed to express yourself. You're allowed to be joyful. You're allowed to put yourself out there and expect an audience possibly, but the idea that whatever you encounter, it's your right to be in that space. And so what comes to the very end is, you know, in terms of my thinking, which is interesting, as, I mean, this is the first book I've ever written. So the idea of the end becomes sort of, you know, the beginning of the next project, is really thinking about how Latinx communities work with memory. What the memories do we have? What memories do we long for that we lack? Many of us have sort of these very short narratives of what is our family history, right? We just don't know whether it's from migration or just, you know, alienation, right? There's a loss there. And to me, that's a huge sticking point as we think about the popular, right? What then gets presented to us. Because what we find is that we're sort of creating these memories on the fly when we see something happening in pop culture, in a movie, in a graphic novel, and saying, oh, I want that. And it's sort of working in a kind of reverse, right? To be able to say, I want that. And if I do that now, then 20 years from now, my daughter, my niece, my nephew will have this reference point. And so it's a really fun sort of conversation about time, and sort of a very nonlinear sense about time and memory, but it's also about thinking about what does it mean to be put in a spotlight? What does it mean to own, right, a public space, particularly in the United States, when we understand, particularly under Donald Trump, we understood this idea that it was dangerous to be publicly brown, publicly Latino, publicly immigrant, publicly undocumented. And so part of thinking about quinceañeras and thinking about the digital sphere and the way that quinceañeras as a theme appear in so many different places is that these become documentations for ourselves. We are documenting ourselves. And part of that documentation process is creating breadcrumbs, right? Breadcrumbs for the next generation that maybe look different. Maybe it's not the archives. It's going to be the television archives that we turn to be like, what were we doing in the early 2000s? Well, check out the Quince and 30 Rock, because that one resonates, right? Or check out these places where we find ourselves. And so the stories of who we are, where we came from, and what we want, I feel like we're going to start looking in different places. And that's really, I say in a nutshell, what the book is about.
Wow. So, I mean, space, time, dialectics, artivism, self-posturing and positioning, hemispherics. What isn't it about somehow, right? It's amazing. Really, Rachel, amazing.
Thank you.
So, yeah, I mean, in a way, we've kind of gotten at this, but class and gender are so significant in this kind of living pop cultural space that,
Absolutely. And it's
you
really
know,
it's kind of, I think I wrote this for a piece that was in one of your pop culture books, was thinking about these borderlands, right? And it's not just the ethno-racial, but it's the contextual borderlands between the folklore and the popular culture and the mediated and the live, right? That it used to be, we thought we could separate, and really not so much anymore, right? Where the narratives of, specifically thinking about sort of the ethno-racial. So we're thinking about representations, the social imaginary of what it is to be Latinx in the US, coming into conversations with the social values are assumed to be middle class or upper class, that are being somehow performed by people we assume are working class. And in the same way, women, young women, old women, femmes, people that don't necessarily identify in the binary, become they're contesting their shaping of an environment that fits their gendered identity or their gendered expression, is again part of this cycle of building and changing these quote unquote traditions that are living, right? And so we get all these piled together at different points, and that's why we get, quinceañera reality shows, or that's why we get, MTV Quince shows, or the pop culture references, where these events are so saturated, right? You could go into any little piece. You could look, thinking about this image, this beautiful image in front of you, right? The idea of thinking about how expensive that multi-tiered cake likely is. That cake's easily probably $1,000. Right? Because, and not even because it's that great, but because it's a custom piece, right? So this notion of buying the sense of, there's something for us out there, we need to create it.
Oh my goodness. Next time you teach when you're off your sabbatical or your leave, let me know. I want to take some of your classes, Rachel.
Sure.
So yeah, you've shared some of your surprises in your research, and maybe there's some others, and a couple of the challenges, but maybe we can put a kind of a spotlight on that part of your research. Yeah.
Sure. So I love the images you have here. So my work was ethnographic. So that means I was, out observing, talking to people, but my sites of entry really weren't going to people's parties, although I did go to a bunch. But those weren't really where I was paying attention. I was really interested in the aesthetics of really what were popularized in the early 2000s as Quinceañera Expos. And these were built out of these Latina bridal expositions that didn't really grow the way that people hoped they would, these sort of racialized wedding exhibitions. But what you had, what Rafael Aguayo, who was the leader of Quinceañeras magazine out of Las Vegas, which has grown exponentially in the last 20 years, said is that, you get families coming to these bridal expos for Latinas looking for quinceañera things, right? And looking for objects that they could be repurposed for a quinceañera. And they realized, good Lord, we need to tap into this market and give people what they want, which is something with quinceañera in the title, because part of the outward shopping was getting people to buy into an idea that they were trying to piece together on the fly. So it was really interesting to think about expos. I went to so many expos across California and across the country. And one of the most interesting things was the fact that the expo was an event unto itself, right? It was sort of it was a run through of a quinceañera in all of these interesting ways. But one of the things that was most interesting was being greeted at the door by staff in tuxedos, who were treating everyone who walked in there, and their grandmother, who was also there, right, as guests. It was really, really interesting to think about, what were people really shopping for? They were shopping for acceptance. They were shopping to be a target audience. The idea that one of the things that came up with watching people be at these expos, right? And part of it, I used to count, and I laughed that I would be in line for an expo because they would hold the doors, so there was a big crowd to come into these rooms, these ballrooms usually all across the country. And it was sort of counting the expensive cell phones. It was counting, the Coach purses on these girls, the free boots, when I was in Chicago in the winter, and like the luxury, right? This idea of luxury. And I'd stand there and say, I thought they told us we were all poor. I thought they told, this idea of what does it mean to be in this space, to sort of be making demands, and not just be making demands within your community, but this consumer identity was absolutely this narrative of belonging on a national level, right? And saying, no, 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 no. I remember this one woman, I was in line and I heard her criticizing the organizers because one of the large expo entryway sort of signs that's these 6 foot tall covers, like the cover model, the pictures that we have here. And she was saying, this is last year's design. I want to see this year's design. And I was like, yes, you tell them. Like, this idea of making demands, right? To me was like, this is what and it really, what it came down was like, that's it. That, whatever is inciting that sort of sense of comfort to say, no, 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 this is my world, you work in it, was sort of this hinge moment of saying, that's what this is doing. This isn't about, being 16 or being 17 or becoming an adult for these women. It was this idea of presencing, right? Creating a presence in public, right? And this, to me in particular, I grew up with parents who are Chicanos, but my father was raised in El Paso, and he remembers when, people would get beat for speaking Spanish in school, right? This idea of a public narrative of Latinx identity, and then watching these mothers and daughters, just be like, this isn't good enough. And I was like, yes, how come this idea of a generation of young Latinas who are saying, oh, no, I'm worth much more than what you're putting out here, I'll pass, is a different kind of mindset than the mujer abnegada, right? That woman who's taking and absorbing and assuming she deserves it because that's her role. And these girls are more that, no, this won't work. But these spaces, one of the things that was most interesting is ethnographic spaces is that they're ephemeral. They're not permanent. So when you go to one, I document as much as possible and try to be in the moment, and then they're gone, right? And then they pop up again, in a different state or, different county, depending on the saturation, right? Iowa, Nebraska, Illinois, all with their own kind of regional flair, but then gone. And to me, that was really fascinating because there was this idea of as you see these expos building, you realize that someone has decided that there's enough of a Latinx population with money to open that event that year, right? And so to me, they were these indicators, right? It was something you couldn't count. You wouldn't necessarily know to count otherwise. So to me, that was really promising. And then watching, some of the surprises really became the kinds of objects for sale in some ways, watching people talk about how they were going to rent a stretched Porsche or a stretched Cadillac, like this luxury, this connection with luxury that, again, stereotypically, right, we're just not depicted as in our wheelhouse, right? That's not what we do. And so to me, those were really powerful. I also had a lot of people asking me if I planned quinceañeras. I said, no, I'm a professor. And they're like, but you could. So I had a lot of people who wanted to ask me about what I thought about dresses and what was traditional. I said, well, what you're doing is traditional. But it was a funny kind of people definitely looking for answers and understanding that commercial spaces, popular culture spaces, these were the spaces of cultural creation, right? As much as we want it to be viejitos at home or on a porch, there is that too, but many of us never had that. And so the idea that the popular pop culture, pop art makes these elements accessible to us is something that we need to embrace. So those were some of with ethnography, it's always fun. It's just hard to absorb it all. Just be like, oh, I should write on all of this at once. And the bouncy houses and, everything that became part of the culture of these spaces.
Not to mention consulting on the side, right?
I was like, I guess I have a side gig if this thing doesn't work.
So tell us, obviously you don't need to convince me of this, but the study and teaching of race and gender and Latinx pop culture, why it matters. And you've touched on so much. And I love also this wonderful, enriched kind of, learning that you've taken me through with presencing and belonging and creating spaces where our families and community can feel confident and feel like they have the right to ask. But yeah, can you take teaching and all this stuff? And I of course have some of my favorites up here on the slide.
Of course. No, I think this is beautiful. Why do I think of this? Why does it matter? Well, on so many levels. I think, and this maybe comes in with the next question that you have positioned here, and that's thinking a little bit about, stepping back as a teacher and a researcher, right? And thinking about what tools are we using to talk to our students now, our communities now, and how many of those absolutely do not resonate with people who are 18 and 19 now. And I laugh and I think a little bit about the ways in which we're using old tools in a lot of ways. Not that it's not useful, but if we think about the way in which popular culture now, who's making it, right? It's a different generation of cultural producers, even in this moment, right? Thinking about I use a lot of TikTok, I use, Instagram, I use any kind of visual creation, because part of what I tell my students is we're talking about cultural emergence. And I don't really care if it was a story you were told as a child, or if you heard it on, someone telling a story on TikTok. This is how our community communicates. And that becomes a really interesting political question as we think about higher education and deciding even sort of like old terms, like thinking about what is canon, right? What becomes canonical in this educational context? And somehow we decided, based on a time when there wasn't social media or the internet or computers or electricity, that there were certain kinds of knowledge coming from certain kinds of material sources that were prioritized, right? That were the best. I don't think that's the same anymore. I think the way in which we need to rethink how our communities communicate. And then with that understanding, say, okay, now we have the visual, we have the material, we have the auditory, and then we have all these convergences, right, in space. The sincere, the satirical, the moving picture, the art, static art, all of these things. And so I think as we think about bringing popular culture studies into the classroom, they actually give us a chance in conversation with, other kinds of texts, right? Whether it's scholarly text on popular culture or just other texts. They actually can get us talking from the get-go in a way that's actually relevant to what the community is living now. And to me, that's really powerful, because one of the things that my students have said, over the years of teaching, is the idea that they never thought they would take a class that actually spoke to them in the way that they say, it's not just the type of content in terms of, Latinx oriented, but the idea of the kinds of materials they'd be allowed to talk about. And so we don't even realize, so it's particularly with race and gender, right? I think a lot about brown queer women, and the idea of thinking about popular culture in that way gives a platform and a voice, right? And a kind of a starter ground for a conversation that's so different, right? That's potentially so different that will go so many different directions. So I think if we want to keep up with different generations, I think we have to be attuned to the popular and attuned to pop culture in particular.
Well, okay, so actually the slide kind of got reversed here, but let's jump here, because let's jump to, okay, hold on, no, that's fine. Okay, so I am really curious, because you're like the go-to person on this. I only know a couple of quince, like cine kind of expressions, but like, can you talk about that space? And it's almost a selfish question.
I mean, and this is interesting. So for Quinceañera Cine, right, thinking about films or that are taking the topic, there's a kind of a huge, much like the books, there's kind of a huge gap. There's some serious film, right, some of the things that you're showing here that are really meant to be dramas that are trying to say, that Latinx culture communities are sort of a moving target. So we can't talk about it by language or by place necessarily anymore, or even by ethno-national identity, right? But the idea of the tradition is something that can bind people. And so it becomes a moving target that we can kind of follow. And then there's this whole body of kind of like tween films where there's actually quite a bit of them, where they're coming of age stories that are kind of slapped together with a quinceañera theme. I have a few posters. So some of these Quinceañera Expos had people come and sign posters for these. Really, to me, they seem like made for TV film. But the idea to me is the same, right? The idea of saying the presence of this particular tradition or this particular event sometimes in very central ways and sometimes in more marginal ways is a marker of presence, right? Is a marker of saying, we want Latinos to watch this, so we might slap a Latino sticker on it and call it like inclusive. So, there's that kind of shallow. And then there are, stories that revolve around the teenage girl who's coming of age and a very, cotton candy middle class, completely devoid of race and class politics. And that becomes a narrative of our community as well. This idea of saying that there are these huge, disparate experiences of Latinx communities that can be viewed essentially through sort of the avatar of the quinceañera, right? In terms of film, I think there's still a lot lacking. There's still a lot to be said, but I think it's meant to draw people in. I think much like Leah's, work on the street in Mexico City, is there's something about this tradition that resonates because it can resonate with fathers and uncles, people who have this nostalgic connection to sort of, the heteronormative family dynamic or cultural conservatism on some way. And then you can get these stories that take you, 100 miles from that place. So I think that it's quite powerful, not just with Quinces, but with cultural practices in general, right? Following sort of those breadcrumbs. But yeah.
Yeah, really, really amazing. So, and this is kind of, we are now 19%, depending on where we're kind of counting, but we are definitely the majority historically underrepresented. That is a fact. And yet we still, you and I and others are kind of like, where are our stories in the mainstream popular culture space? And, when we are represented, it's often as, these kind of, degenerates, criminals, buffoons, etc. But how do you respond today with your work and everything that you're excited about and your students? And
it's an interesting mix of talking to students, particularly because we'll look at different pieces of popular culture, in class, and poking fun and saying, who made this? What are we doing? In some ways, turning it onto a commercial lens and saying, we're being sold. We're being sold as a commodity. What does that look like? What are people interested in buying? And we very much get into this conversation of saying, people value our traditions, but don't necessarily value us as people, right? And so having these conversations becomes extremely important. And these types, right? Understanding these different types. I mean, think of how far back these go, right? Thinking about old, whether it's Carmen Miranda or Maria Félix, all these different sort of archetypes of femininity or masculinity or race that are still generating funds. Like I always kind of laugh and I was like, Sofia Vergara makes a lot of money. I'm sure she might not like what she's doing, but she's doing all right. And we kind of laugh about sort of this, managing sort of a consumer identity. I think it's sort of the same conversation that you probably have with a lot of folks, which is, can we say that part of this is who's in control, right, of networks, of production houses, right? Who has the ability to say, like, we'll not do that. I'm just thinking about like one day at a time, right? And figuring out these programs that absolutely can speak to our cultural experiences, but aren't necessarily being sold to other audiences. And this is, I think, one of the things that we need to consider, right? When we think about, let's just say, Sofia Vergara or Devious Maids, right, as a concept, right? usually, as I talk to my students, I'm like, well, does this appeal to you? And most of 95% of my students are Latino or Latinx. And, this idea of understanding markets and audiences, right? And thinking about what does it mean to move into a place of power, right? Where you can say like, nah, I'm not going to fund that. So I think we're on our way. There are places, I think about like one day at a time. And I get irritated at one day at a time because I was like, wait a minute. I'm kind of like, wait, everyone's playing. Are we Cuban? Are we Puerto Rican? Are we Mexican? Right. So there's still, you can't tell me you couldn't find someone else. There's still these issues. Right. But I think overall, right, having stories, having actual Latinx people playing these roles, right. And even moving past something like, I think of George Lopez now as looking pretty dated, right. His old shows, but it was a start. Right. And we're just getting our start later than other people. Right. And so I always think about, how are we present? How are we present? How do we need to change that? And, we just got to keep moving forward.
Yeah, it's funny. I hosted a conversation with Stephanie Beatriz from Brooklyn Nine-Nine last week, and I opened by just asking the hard question, like, why Sonia in Modern Family? Why? Because I understand Sofia Vergara because, my God, like she's still the highest paid actor. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But, and she's like, honestly, I had to pay the bills. And, I tried to do what I could with that extremely stereotyped, role that I was given. But, what could I do? Turn it down? I could have done that. But then I had to put food on the table.
Yeah.
In the end, we have to kind of think about things like that. We don't necessarily need to let Sofia Vergara off the hook, right? Yeah. But we can definitely. So, this was a weird moment for me, the Super Bowl 2020. And it was like, I wanted to be really happy, but then I was like kind of cringing too, especially the kind of, speaking of style and identity on the shelf that you had mentioned so sort of beautifully earlier. But how did you respond to it and then through your lens?
So I remember talking about this with my students. We were still in class then. And so I remember very distinctly, like, we put it on, like everyone was like looking around. I was like, we're going to watch it and we're going to talk about it. And one, that cringeworthy was really, so twofold, right? I'm on two sides of this. One is the idea of like, are those kids in cages? What's happening here? Like, to me, it was this idea of saturation of imagery, which I kind of appreciated because so much of this was only going to be understood by certain people. And so even just thinking about how, hey, this performance in some ways is only directed to a subset of our population, right? And maybe it's Latinx, maybe it's politically aware, whatever it is, right? There was something to that kind of customizing. This isn't for everyone, but some of you are going to get this message. The idea of two iconic Latin American performers together was really interesting. This sort of, people were kind of claiming this like feminist powerhouse. Part of what was really, to me, I just sort of laughable, but also this point of contention was like, when do Latinas not have to take off their clothes? I was like, I get it. J-Lo is smoking. She's 50 years old. Like, that's unfair, right? Really? Like, what is the sort of the idea that it's, and everyone was saying, oh, Shakira's had a baby or two babies. You're like, okay, so it doesn't become like, in those tacones, she's like gallivanting around stage, which is amazing. And on a pole going around. So there was this idea of, when is it enough, right? Latina, thinking about this idea of having to be everything to everyone. And I think J-Lo really, whether it's perfume and music and movies and television and, being everything to everyone, having twins, having a husband, when is it enough? Like, when can she say, I'm just gonna, I can just be in public in jeans and a cute shirt. I don't have to be able to like wear what I wore, to the Oscars 10 years ago and still kill it. So I think that there's an interesting kind of way, one, that people want to consume Latinas in particular, right? As though this is, for some of us, we're saying, oh my God, that's so intimidating. I'll never be like that. But there's also the way in which this is almost the only way that Latinas can be taken seriously, right? Right. No one's tuning in to Sonia Sotomayor, as much as we would like. The icons still remain these hypersexualized, light-skinned, straight-haired women who are beautiful. But if we think about, again, that narrative of what we're seeing for generations, right? What is still there is that we still have a lot of work to do. And nothing against Shakira or J-Lo, right? They're fantastic. They're wonderful. They're icons. And that idea of getting paid, right? We know this to be true, right? Same thing with Sofia Vergara. She's getting paid, and anyone who thinks that she's not a performer, that somehow she's stumbling onto stage and just being herself, is not the case, right? I think that's that crux of thinking about, when we think about the popular. They're performers. They're professional performers. And I think that's one of the ways in which we get sort of the hyper criticism is like, well, they shouldn't be doing this. Like, they're actors and musicians. Like, they aren't expecting you to think that when they're home with their children, they're swinging on poles, right? Or that they're doing the hyper stereotypical accent, right? This is a job. And I think sometimes we forget that they aren't just they literally weren't like, oh, okay, that's your waist size to your hip ratio. We're just going to put you in. These people have trained and are skillful in what they do. And so they should get paid, right? But the idea that we need to look at them as professionals, right? Rather than think that all that they're doing is walking on stage and somehow being unreflexive in what they're doing. So I think that, to me, is something that I always think about.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you. Really giving me a lot to think about there, especially that phrase of yours, having to be everything to everyone for, us Latinxes.
Sure.
We carry that with us all the time, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Think about
So
1,000 things that you're doing at once.
yeah.
I know from outside your university, right? Everyone knows you, Fred. Everyone knows you, and everyone knows the hustle, right? And it's like, oh my God, like, okay, I got one book, 20 more to go, but it's true, right? And we've been, we trained really young to think about, if you're going to make it, you have to do it's not even just like double the work. You have to do 5 times the work. You have to be 5 times as friendly, more interested, more available. And that's that question too, this idea of the availability of Latina bodies when we think about J-Lo. And then stepping back for a second and thinking about, what does it mean to be able to choose your presence, right? To choose what you put out in the world. And, to different extremes, right? This idea of Latina spectacle, is sort of really what the book is about. To be that spectacle. J-Lo is that spectacle. Shakira is that spectacle. They get paid for it. That's a profession. In the same way, the quinceañera who's, particularly, here in Texas, walking down the Capitol grounds in Austin, is making a spectacle of herself and inadvertently inserting herself into history. And sometimes people know that and want to be seen, and sometimes they don't, right? But I think that the understanding our capacity becomes huge. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. So I'm so glad you mentioned that, because in a way, this question about your teaching and your kind of method of teaching and what you do in your classroom, we've done already a lot of that, but I do have a really what is it that you hope that your students will take away from the experience of being in a learning space with you?
So I got this one. I'll keep it short. So I hope that when my students come away from my classrooms, they understand that knowledge is created hierarchically, right? We understand it to be hierarchical. But when we really look at it, right, I have a project, one of my big required courses on Latinx cultural theory has students doing a variety of different research methods at once. And so they're looking at archival material, they're looking at academic peer-reviewed kind of work, they're doing ethnographic interviews, and then they're drawing from a piece of popular culture. And where popular culture is very broadly defined as a blog, Twitter, television, film, playwright, any kind of manner of circulation like that. And the goal, and I always tell them, the goal is for them to understand that these forms of knowledges are only unequal because someone 100 years ago said common people practice a certain kind of knowledge making and elite people practice another kind, right? So to say that we can take away a sense of knowledge equality, right, is really where I'm coming from with my students. And I say, if you're talking about an interview with your tia, that's great. If you're talking about the music playing in a novela, that's equal footing, right? The narratives that are being created in these spaces are only unequal from a certain politicized perspective. That's race-based, that's gender-based, that's age-based, that's language-based, right? And so for me, it's about understanding so as I kind of said before, right, how our communities communicate, but also how we produce and circulate knowledge, right? And although in academia, I tell them, this is still academia, this is still a very elite space. We understand citation politics, we understand using journals and published books from a certain kind of perspective, but we need to understand, and in my classes we do this, is that we integrate other forms of knowledge that aren't below those other pieces. They're just different, right? And so for my students, it becomes really powerful. Particularly, a lot of people end up interviewing family members, usually their parents, about certain ideas. And the idea that they're talking about, talking through academic scholarship, what their mama said, and an Instagram post, right, with an image or something they're interpreting to them is really exciting. And so for me, it's also really exciting to see the ways in which they're able to personalize and understand systemic inequalities, right? That it isn't a reality. It's a systemic understanding of whose knowledge matters, whose voices matter.
Knowledge equality. I love that, Rachel. Thank you. And for you, this kind of speaks maybe also to the kind of question of your future work, but where are you seeing the vitality today in pop culture buy-in about Latinxes today?
Yeah, and I was thinking about this, and it's honestly, it's this idea of queerness. I think and that's one of the sort of, queerness, non-binary folks, like the use and the presence of sort of non-stereotypical, like heteronormative images that used to be really niche, right? Thinking about like Chicana lesbians, that whole book, and thinking about some of the art that appeared and the poetry that appeared, and then thinking about these other areas where queerness is thinking about butch identity, right? We had talked about that previously in our lives together, right? Thinking about characters that are emerging as powerful, well-written, central characters, right? Not necessarily comic relief or not necessarily sidekick-oriented, right? But not just this idea of sexuality, right? But this idea of what becomes, a kind of social positioning, right? Of being different, of being part of an alterity, being a counter narrative to expectations that I think is really powerful. So, thinking about any queer producers, queer, activists and artists. I was following a young trans actress who appeared a few years ago in a Quinceañera special on HBO, sort of a 4-part series that was produced by Thalia. She's a mujer trans in LA, young woman who's now going to be starring in I think it's The Craft, some of the reboots, and she's Mexicana, she's from LA, she's trans, right? There's all these identities and you're thinking, what's going to happen? It's like the idea of something not necessarily being turned on its head. I don't think we have to have the expectation of that somehow queerness or non-binariness is going to be like the opposite of what's present, but it's like something just sort of tilts. And I think for thinking about sort of where our vitality lies, it's in those small changes, right? So I'm thinking big Q for, thinking about queer, but also small Q, right? Things that are thinking not about academia, but about these ways of coming into being, and thinking about pop culture as a place where our culture is coming into being in so many different ways, and that we have to give it a kind of respect based on our own the gaps in our own histories, right? I tell people all the time, the things that people ask, like, oh, how do you know about whether it was quinceañeras? I'm like, I saw the movie, thinking about when it was sort of first coming out, or even like the quinceañera, the quarantine quinceañeras. I've been following them because I'm not working really on Quinces anymore. But watching people do the drive-by, honking balloons, right? This mediated form, right? All of that is coming sort of from these external places, whether it's formal cultural production or sort of informal documentation through social media or on the streets. So I think the subtle nuances, but definitely this idea of, I'd say, queer interventions is really why I'm interested these days.
Amazing. Rachel, Valentina González, my goodness, you have taken me and our viewers and listeners on such a journey. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate being able to talk about my work.